Good morning and welcome everyone to our first webinar for the year 2023. My name is Pamanda Mhlongo, Senior Programs Officer at the Democracy Development Program, and I'll be sort of moderating today's session. And we are in a discussion this morning around the role of labor movements in consolidating South Africa's democracy and development. And we essentially want to talk through what are current manifestations of labor movements in our country and to what extent are they contributing to the unfolding sort of democratic dispensation. I was just lamenting with our speakers before we started that it's unfortunate that we spent the entirety of the month of May and we are only convening at the end. But of course, we all recognize that there are a variety of things that we're dealing with. And so better late than ever, we hope, and that we hope that these discussions of this nature are things that we are continuously engaged with as citizens, as civil society, as academics, as people who have the agency to contribute meaningfully to this space. And so I have three very special guests who will be helping us to unpack this discussion, and we hope that you will be able to engage with us via our social media as well as on our comment section, because we want to try and make this discussion as engaging as possible. So comment any questions that you may have, any thoughts that you thought about before you join this session. For anyone who might not be able to engage us on this live discussion, or should you have an issue with load shedding where you are and you cut off for whatever reason, this will be also on the Mail and Guardian YouTube page as soon as we're done with the presentation. But you're also able to view it via the YouTube page at the moment. We just prefer that you view it on the specific link that you have at the moment so that we can have access to your comments and questions at a live basis. So ultimately, the nature of the discussion is as follows. In South Africa, we have a labor movement, or rather labor movement specifically, that have played a central role in shaping our transition to democracy. It's remained an open question as to whether Labour could sustain its involvement during the period of consolidation after the first democratic elections in 1994. As was evidenced in other emerging democracies, economic liberalization often led to stagnation and high costs imposed on workers while weakening the state. Debate continues at the moment among activists, academics in our country over the current status of labour movements, whether it's whether it is dead or being reborn in the new organizational forms and or broader class movements. There's no question, for us at least, that the labor movement in our country is fragmented and is changing. Unions have lost some sense of political appeal for many, including many young workers, insofar as their influence and power. They represent a declining population of wage workers in an economy hit by restructuring and retrenchments in the so-called informal sector. Labor, when used as a collective force, is capable of shaping democratization through the strategic use of power. Labor has a potential through participation, negotiated compromises to ensure that the costs of adjustments are not borne by workers alone. In this discussion, we want to try and engage along some of these themes. So what is the role of trade unions in South Africa's liberation struggle? How do we engage the impact, for instance, of the tripartite alliance on our politics and governance, considering that Labour, through COSATU, forms a component of that governance system? Has the decrease in membership of organizations like the COSATU, for instance, and the emergence of SAFTU fragmented negatively the power of trade unions? How can unions become enablers towards building a culture of human rights? And ultimately, a question of social justice tied to our economic conditions. For our speakers today, we have Ms. Nondambego Luzipo, who is a SAFTU Deputy General Secretary, and she'll start us off in terms of her initial inputs into the discussion. After that, we'll be joined by Rais Nurbay, who's a writer and activist. He is the National Coordinator of the Socialist Youth Movement and the Chairperson of the Student Forum at Wits University, where he's doing his postgraduate studies in astrophysics. And then, of course, we'll round off the discussion with Andile Zulu, who Zulu is the Energy Democracy Officer at the Alternative Information and Development Center. He writes on political and economic issues for local and international publications. So we have a very accomplished group of speakers that we're going to be joined on today. But before Nondambego starts us off on the discussion, I just want to maybe speak to some issues that we've been seeing from the April 2023 Household Affordability Index, which tracks food price data from 47 supermarkets in areas such as Johannesburg, Durban, Cape Town, and Pietermaritzburg, and of course Springbok in Northern Cape. In April 2023, the average cost of household food basket is now sitting at 5,023 rands 95 cents. The month-on-month growth, the average cost of the household food basket increased by 57 rands 75 cents. That's 1.2% from 4,966 rands 20 in March 2023 to 5,023 rand 95 cents in April 2023. And of course, the year-on-year cost is increased by 481 rands, which is 10.6% from last year to the current one. And so when you look at what's happening in labor, for instance, you'd realize that the national minimum wage is at 25 rand 42 cents an hour, and 203 rand 36 cents for an 8-hour day. In April 2023, with 17 working days, the maximum national working wage for a general worker was 3,457 rands 12 cents. Workers work to support their family. Dispersed in a worker's family of 4 persons, for instance, the national minimum wage is reduced to 864 rands 28 cents, and this is below the upper bound poverty line of 1,417 rands per capita per month. All of these are indicating that we are in a very difficult economic environment, but of course, there are a variety of other issues that we like to engage with that are linked to the economics of this country, but ultimately around the social democratic space that we find ourselves in. Nontembeko Luzipo, let me welcome you for your initial inputs. And each of the speakers will have about 5 to 10 minutes for their initial inputs. And of course, you can continue to engage us on the comments and chat section. Please feel free to also tweet about this and tag us at DDP_democracy on all of the social media. Thank you very much. Nontembeko, over to you.
Good morning, Spamandla, and good morning to everyone who has joined us through this webinar. One would like to appreciate the fact that you have considered SAFTU as part of the people that will be engaging with you, in particular on May. Remember, May to us is a workers' month, so we really appreciate the opportunity. But firstly, one should start from here to say that what is the role of the labor movement in consolidating the democracy and the development? The role of the labor movement, it will start with to hold the government accountable. Meaning that when you hold the government accountable, you hold the government accountable on the human rights, which are enshrined in the Constitution, in addressing the social ills, the challenges of the infrastructure. The other one will be to protect the workers. How then does trade unions or the Federation of Trade Unions protect the workers? It means that, remember that we have got laws in place, meaning that we need to protect the workers in terms of the labor regulations that are there in place. We have many, one would even say that there are many challenges also within. There are many things that we are experiencing that are indicating that maybe we are not yet there in responding to that. One will say that you will know that we've got things like employment equity. We are still a country where we know that we still have got a challenge of women or female who are less occupying higher position or positions of power in many places of employment. If they happen to do that, they get less paid. They are not paid the salary that will be equal to a male counterpart, or even there are still racial lines within our salaries. So those are the things that the employment equity seeks to address, and the trade union movement, it needs to challenge them. The second one, which you have also indicated, will be the issues of the national minimum wage, of which it's a very big pack, because we'll have to unpack it good. When we talk about the national minimum wage, what we are talking about, as you have already said, that can we go for national minimum wage, or can we, because SAFT is for the living wage. I think you have already indicated that for a good basket, when one makes groceries, when you go into the shop for a good basket, you need to have 4,900, which is more. Even that basket, when one considers, it's only when we are talking about your cupboard and your fridge. We have not touched the issue of the electricity. You have not touched the issue of the transport, because the transport, it will include even your kids. And we are talking about a minimum of 4 household people when we say that a good basket will be 4,900 or 5,300. We're talking about a minimum of 4 people in the household. So those are the things that's why SAFTU is saying that our position is for a living wage, and the demand of SAFTU for a living wage will be 12,500, so that it can be able to accommodate all these challenges that are experienced by workers. Also, the other challenge that we are having is that we need to protect the workers, and making sure that the employers, they do comply with the sectoral determination. In that, although we do have this national minimum wage, but there are still many companies, in particular in the security sector, who do not comply with that neither apply for exemptions until they are being challenged. Because if you cannot comply with that, at least do something. You've got a right to apply to be exempted. But at times you find out the unions, they need to fight that. So that's why I'm saying the protection of workers needs to be addressed on that we make sure that the companies, they comply to sectoral determination. Maybe if I can even remind the country on the challenges that we're having, which tells you that it's the negligence of the sectoral determination or the laws that are in place that are undermined by the companies. A good example would be the challenge that we keep on experiencing in the road freight sector, where at some point we'll have trucks that will not be moving or they will be banned. Our country is a good country because it does have laws, but one will say that because the paper accepts anything that is written on them until someone challenges it, it remains a law. We do have a law that indicates the employment of in terms of the road freight sector that will allow the employers to employ foreign nationals, but there is a percentage to address that as to how many, what is the percentage, what is the ratio, which is 30-70%. They are allowed to employ 30% of foreign nationals, but because there is a violation of that, and our government is not taking responsibility in making sure that the employers, they don't violate that. So it is the responsibility of also the trade unions to make sure that we protect workers from laws that are in place, but the companies, they refuse it. They tend to ignore those lawyers. We also, those laws. We also have to hold the government accountable, on their commitments. We can count a number of commitments. In particular, we will see again another commitments next year, 2024, because we're approaching the national elections. That's where they start to renew or review their commitments, of which they will not honor, because when we sit and we experience load shedding, it's one of the commitments that is not being honored by the government, because they have promised us the electricity. When you see the crisis that we are having in Hamaskral of the recent cholera, it's also a failed commitment, because we were promised water, sanitation, and all that. Those are the failed commitments that the government has failed to honor to us. So we've also have got the responsibility to look at that. Also, we need to make sure that we have campaigns for a decent living wage, campaigns to alleviate the poverty, campaigns to address unemployment, campaigns to access to education and healthcare, campaigns to fight austerity budget, because when we've got this austerity budget, we know its implication, in particular in the public sector, because that results to unemployment of police officers, and it makes the police stations at some point to be closed, because we've got shortages of police officers that cannot respond when they are called at times. It also comes into the frustration that we experience as the workers and the working class, we have got the only means we have to make sure that we get access to health. It will be through public hospitals. But we know that there is a frustration as well there, and the load shedding is adding more frustration, because you understand that is why we have also joined the application to the court to say exempt schools, exempt hospital, exempt police stations, so that when it's load shedding, they must not be load shedded, because there is a frustration already of shortages of the nurses, of the equipment. Everything is just collapsing in the hospital. So we should not burden the hospitals or the nurses or healthcare workers with another frustration of load shedding. So those are the things that we have to fight for, to fight for the austerity. The other thing that is new or that is cropping in our democracy is a serious corruption. Many things that have collapsed, the collapse of the SOEs, if you can see, we used to have PRASA, it's a frustration now how workers, they need to make sure that they reach their workplaces one on time, because PRASA was one also of the reliable and the fast way to reach your workplace, besides the traffic on the road taking a taxi. And it was, secondly, it was affordable. But now people, they make sure that because you'll buy a ticket, you know that at least you are accommodated for a week or for a month. But now you've got this thing of having to pay every day before you go to work, and you must make sure that you've got a bus fare back home. So the collapse of the SAA, it's quite a number of corruption that we have experienced. And also we need to make sure that in the process of fighting this corruption, we also guide against privatization, because we can see that every time there is this corruption, the direction takes the entity into a privatization, which is a more compromise to the workers. So those are the rights that I would say that it's things that we have to fight in making sure that we've got not only a democracy, but the workers, they do benefit in this democracy. And it's a democracy that keeps on developing, and it is of beneficiary to the workers and the working class. Thank you, Spamandla.
Thank you very much for your introductory remarks, Nontembeko. We take note of the idea or the insistence that there ought to be a lot more campaigning done by labor movements, specifically around a lot of the issues that are being confronted by South Africans as a whole. The idea of austerity and how austerity ultimately impacts labor, but also impacts on the ability of the government to deliver on its promises. We spoke about issues such as unemployment and inequality that are core features of the things that we want to be able to solve for. And perhaps this idea of ensuring that the national minimum wage is not just a national minimum wage, but a living wage. The consideration that there are a variety of factors that, for instance, the household affordability index doesn't account for. When you speak about the lack of electricity, for instance, the lack of secure energy in this country as a negative impact on the ability of labor to continue to do its work. But you also spoke about the role of employers and what their complicity is in some of this, when they choose to not abide by existing laws, and only when challenged, then they are raising issues of needing exemptions, whereas those exemptions ought to be sought beforehand, before even being challenged. And so I think that helps us to start off the discussion quite well. We have with us Rais Norbay, who I've mentioned earlier on, is the Socialist Youth Movement coordinator at the university and chairperson of the Student Forum at the university. What is your take, Rais, on the discussion we're having at the moment?
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Just quick correction, I'm no longer the chair of Student Forum, in case anybody jumps down my throat. That structure's days are numbered. It will become a student parliament, but that's another discussion. I do want to start with a unfinished essay that was found in the desk of Leon Trotsky after his murder in 1940. And I mean, I'm not digging up old Marxist piece of literature that's more than 80 years old just because I find it interesting, because I do. But because of the fact that this essay, Trade Unions in the Epoch of Imperialist Decay, speaks very clearly in many cases to what the current state of the labor movement is in this country. And so it starts out with, there's one common feature in the development, or more correctly, the degeneration of modern trade union organizations throughout the world. It is their drawing close to and growing together with the state power. Trotsky goes on to then put forward a slogan saying complete and unconditional independence of the trade unions in relation to the capitalist state. And he frames this as a struggle to turn the trade unions into organs of the broad exploited masses, and not the organs of, and his wording here is important, the labor aristocracy. And I think, so this speaks to two things. One is the divide within within unions, particularly COSATU unions, who, and the tripartite alliance is a lot of what I'm going to speak about, is inside of COSATU unions in the leadership that are completely detached from the rank and file. And because of that, I mean, what we have is this labor aristocracy. What we have is detached leadership. But also, I mean, the unconditional independence from the capitalist state. I think on one hand, this is why SAFTU is crucial as an independent trade union federation. On the other hand, I mean, we've seen the extent to which the union movement, I mean, COSATU, the SACP as well, to a greater degree, actually, is very ensnared inside of this tripartite alliance. But this alliance is one that is straining under its own contradictions. In August of last year, Gwede Mantashe wasn't given a platform to speak at the COSATU Congress because the rank and file wouldn't have it. That same month, the workers of COSATU and SAFTU marched jointly to the union buildings. Again, strong call coming from the rank and file for COSATU to break away from the tripartite alliance. I mean, just to look at the nature of the state that the union is related to through the tripartite alliance. We did speak about, labor regulations and so on, and we do have, I mean, a lot of workers in this country don't know their rights. Education, just basic education about when it is that you can go to the CCMA and the labor courts, and that's important. But also, it's important to notice that there have been regressive amendments to the LRA. They have blunted the strike weapon by drowning it in bureaucracy. So it's so difficult to get a strike certificate. And I mean, that's one of the most powerful mechanisms of direct action we have. I think it's one of the greatest weapons we have that were given to us by the Constitution in order to continue a transition. And I think this comes to my point. I mean, when we're looking at just Gwede, for example, he used to be part of COSATU leadership through the National Union of Mine Workers. He used to be part of the leadership of the South African Communist Party, but from about 2010 or so has been mostly occupying ANC positions. Now we know that he's the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, and I mean, we've seen time and time again communities in this country fighting against multinational corporations, mining corporations, over their land, over their lives, and the state takes the part of the corporation. And so here, to bring another Marxist back from the grave, Marx said that, that the state under capitalism functions as a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. And this is what has been happening. We spoke about a just wage, which is really, really crucial. Inside of the union program, but also a universal basic income grant because of the fact that our unemployment rate is where it is. Definitely the role of the union is to be a shield against attacks, because the moment the union is no longer there, the employer will roll back every victory that you've been able to win. But beyond that, and I think it's important here to ask ourselves two questions. The first is, if I go quickly back to Trotsky, is he puts forward a second slogan, which is trade union democracy. And this, I think, is crucial. He says the trade unions in the present epoch cannot simply be the organs of democracy as they were in the epoch of free capitalism. They cannot any longer remain politically neutral. That is, limit themselves to serving the daily needs of the working class. It can no longer be anarchistic. That is, ignore the decisive influence of the state on the life and the classes. Either the trade unions of our time will serve as secondary instruments of imperial capital to subordinate and discipline the workers and to obstruct the revolution, or on the contrary, the unions will become tools of the revolutionary movement of the proletariat. And so, insofar as unions are concerned, I think the orientation of unions, and again, SAFTU is orientated as a revolutionary socialist trade union federation, but the way in which unions are orientated is really important. I mean, the way we frame this question is, the role in consolidating South African democracy. I think part of the role of the unions is making sure that this current dispensation of capitalist democracy isn't consolidated and entrenched, and that we can push it further back towards worker democracy. And so when it comes to just if we're not shaking hands with the state and the party, the ANC, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be building bridges. I think the unity of the organized working class is key here. And so I just want to use a couple of examples. One of them is GIWUSA, which is the General Industries Workers Union of South Africa, which is a member of the Climate Justice Coalition and has been pushing the Green New Eskom campaign very strongly. I mean, this is about opening our imaginations to the possibility that we don't have to choose between having electricity or having clean air. And we don't have to lose jobs in the process either. Engaging the just transition is something that historically has been done by the union movement, but needs to be expanded. I think the Working Class Summit that was called, and it was first called in 2018 by SAFTU and then subsequently reconvened last year in August. And subsequent to that, there was the National Day of Action, and there were a number of campaigns that were put forward against the rising cost of living, austerity, gender-based violence, and so on. All of these are concrete, the Universal Basic Income Grant. These are really, really great policy proposals. But in and of themselves, they're not going to materialize themselves. And so the idea, and I do want to echo this again and again today, is that, the Revolutionary Union is one machine to mobilize in the battle against capitalism. The Revolutionary Party is the other. And so we've been working towards a mass workers' party for a long time. And that means that we need to join hands as organized labor, as the student movement, as civic activists, as community activists, as broader social justice activists. And I mean, there's a Braamfontein Community Forum, which is doing this on a far smaller scale, uniting the struggles. And part of that was like activists managed to get a rent boycott in solidarity with the South Point strike. And I mean, we've seen political clarity from the unions when it's come to the Clover strike, and the fact that the Israeli Central Bottling Company owns that and basically making the same demand for divestment and for justice for workers, divestment from apartheid Israel and justice for workers. And I think that's also one other crucial thing is internationalism. That historically the trade union movement has been internationalist, at least the socialist trade union movement. And we are saying in a time of worrying xenophobia and Afrophobia, and the unions can be a voice against that. And so I think where it is that we kind of currently stand, and I'll just finish with this, and it's not from Trotsky. So, I mean, we've been speaking about the Working Class Summit. We've mobilized masses in the past. We're now at a point where people are quite desperate for alternatives ahead of next year's election. I mean, we have a group of people who've they've named themselves after a breakfast show on DSTV, but I mean, they've been bold enough to declare a party and intend to run in the elections. And if Rise Mzansi, if they could do that, despite no policy and bragging about the fact that they have no policy, then surely SAFTU, I mean, this mighty trade union federation, has far more reason to be bold. And that's what we need. We need the boldness to declare the party, because without it, the program cannot be protected. And without it, we cannot contest democratically to change the government. We know the ANC government, no matter how many times we bend the ear of this government, it's not going to change towards a revolutionary program. We need to form the Mass Workers' Party, announce the date for the formation of the Mass Workers' Party as soon as possible, and then embark on a program of rolling mass action, because our country is in a state of crisis. And we can't afford to just, be holding the shield. I think the unions now need to become a machine to be mobilized against capital, but that can only happen effectively and electorally in a manner that makes sense and will ensure the victory of the working class if there is a mass workers' party. And so, I mean, the leadership, our Deputy General Secretary is here today, which is great. And I do think the leadership of SAFTU as well should be made very cognizant of it, that from below, from the working class summit formations, I mean, more than 140 working class formations attended the Working Class Summit in 2018. From below, we are asking for a mass workers' party guided by a socialist program, which is crucial as well. And I think the time has come for the declaration of the party. I think if Rise Mzansi could be that bold, Zwelinzima Vavi could be bolder. And that gives us a hope. That gives us something to vote for. And I think that means that the unions are crucial in the future of this country's democracy, not just in maintaining and consolidating capitalist democracy, but transitioning towards genuine worker democracy and the dismantling of the capitalist state, because this is the only way. I mean, in the context of both hunger and the everyday crises that people face and the climate crisis, which we can speak on for another 10 minutes as well. But I do want to also stress that the unions have been part, particularly GUSA, of the Climate Justice Coalition. And we need to keep building links like this. And we need to make that then the foundation for this mass workers' party. And we need to do it quickly. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rais. Rise Mzansi catching strays, but I think it's important that when we talk about the consolidating, as you rightfully put it, that it's also about trying to find out what's next in the states in our stage of development, as it were. And so it's important that whatever configuration this takes, we also learn from what is at the moment. And when you started off speaking about the proximity of labor movements in the current setup through COSATU and the SACP to power, and particularly the capitalist democratic power that we find ourselves in, has made it a bit difficult for labor and for the ground movements to find themselves located in the discourse that we're having at the moment. Of course, the idea of a mass workers' party has been something that I've as you say, the convening has happened since 2018, and I've been hearing about it. I've been thinking through it, at least at a personal level. Prior to that, at least at the ousting, if I can call it that, of Zwelinzima Vavi in and around the 2015-2016 stage from COSATU, and so. What would it look like if Labour was able to mobilize for political power and to think through what would the politics of this country look like? And so, at least I hope that we can be able to have more of that discussion after Andile's presentation. And of course, for you, Andile, take us through what your thoughts are at this point of the discussion. You're just a reminder that you're welcome to please post on the comments any questions or thoughts you may have for our speakers. I see we are already having quite a vast number of engagement from Hansa Naika, from Boniwe Dunster, from Miney Creek, and Gateko Mabasa will be engaging your thoughts and questions after Andile's presentation. But please keep going to ask more questions and more engagement. A reminder that this webinar, whilst being flighted live on this platform, will be available on the Mail and Guardian YouTube page shortly after our presentations, or shortly after the session ends itself. And we look forward to engaging you. Andile, your thoughts?
Thanks, Brian, and thanks to the previous speakers for those useful inputs. I think to begin exploring the question of the role of labor unions towards deepening democracy in South Africa's development, I think it's important to just take stock of where our democracy is right now. And so my thought, and this is something that's been said by many people before, is that South Africa's current economic system and the macroeconomic policies which guide our economic system are profoundly undemocratic. And there is often a conflict between the progressive values in our constitution. So we have this constitution that gives people a lot of political freedom, And then we have an economic system and a policy framework, which then very much dilutes our democratic freedoms. And so I think people have the right towards freedom of speech, but what value does that right have in a context where poverty means that many people cannot read and cannot access technologies to be able to really deepen their understanding and really get involved in the democratic process? People technically have the right to live wherever they want, but spatial inequality and just the domination of landlords across South Africa means that that isn't a reality for most people as well. And so I think when you look at the rates of poverty, the rates of unemployment, of financial precarity, and Unontembeko mentioned as well about the stagnation of wages, you realize that many people aren't substantially free. People don't have the freedom to be able to act on their desires and fulfill their potential because they're impoverished, because they're homeless, because they're starving, because they're in debt. So I think it's important to understand what this economic system is. And really, it's best described as a neoliberal economic system. Many people throw that word around. It's very fashionable. And I think it's important to define what it is. And I always use David Harvey's definition of it. He wrote a really good book a while back called A Brief History of Neoliberalism. And David Harvey defines neoliberalism firstly as a set of economic practices which propose that human well-being can be unlocked by advancing entrepreneurial freedom and skills in a society that has strong property rights, free markets, and free trade. So what he means by neoliberal economic practices are things that the ANC has been pursuing to different extents, but they've been pursuing it generally consistently for the past 28 years. They mean, for example, the privatization of state-owned utilities, or at least pursuing public-private partnerships. They mean deregulating economic activity, which means, removing environmental barriers to certain developments, for example. They also mean things such as austerity. So for the past several years, we've been witnessing the government limit or cut its expenditure on social provision, on the public services. And that has to be taken in context of a cost of living crisis that's occurring as well. And the fact that our population is growing, more people are getting poorer and financially precarious, but we've been drastically cutting our spending on the public good and social good. So that's another example of a neoliberal economic practice. Another one, of course, would be trade liberalization and financialization. So from 1996, you see the boom in the financial sector, which led to many jobs in factories and mines and industries being lost. We often talk of unemployment as a problem of people's skills, but it really is the fact that investors aren't interested in the productive economy of South Africa anymore, not like they used to be before. And so we're consistently seeing those kinds of job losses as well. But a very important thing about neoliberalism, it's not just the policies, it is also a political project. And what David Harvey defines it as a political project to reestablish the conditions for capital accumulation, so make South Africa profitable for those who truly own and run the economy and lead economic activity, and to restore the power of economic elites. So the state's role then, what the government has been doing for the past 28 years, is to create a landscape and an institutional framework that allows for these practices to occur. So in other words, what we have in South Africa is an economy that is tailored to advance the interests of a few, those who sit at the commanding heights of the economy. And it's because neoliberals believe that, economic prosperity is driven by the employer, by the investor, by the entrepreneur, by the shareholder, and not really by the worker, which was, at one point a really dominant perspective. So the instances in which you see this diluting democracy have occurred many times throughout the past 30 years. One of them that is putting us in a crisis now is Eskom. So, a lot of the focus around Eskom is around the pervasive corruption and how corruption is draining resources and allowing criminal entities to thrive. And this is a significant contributor to its issues. But if you go back to 1998, when Eskom pleaded to the government to invest in them to build generative capacity so that we would have enough supply of power to meet demand, Eskom was denied. There was a moratorium put on public investments in Eskom because the government wanted to make space for private players. If you go to the 1998 Eskom white paper, it says quite clearly that they envisioned a significant chunk of energy generation coming from the private sector. 7 years down the line, we have load shedding for the first time in 2007, not because government was incompetent, but because they were trying to appease private players. Another thing, again, Eskom takes out a loan in 2010 from the World Bank. Instead of finding local domestic resources for that, they take out a loan from the World Bank. There's no democratic consultation of people. There's no consultation of the communities that are going to be affected by the environmental damages that would be done by the power stations built through that loan as well. And there's no transparency in the procurement process for those two power stations that were constructed from that loan, Medupi and Kusile. So again, you have an instance with Eskom where there are decisions being taken which affect millions of people, and their interests aren't at the heart of those discussions. And another instance of this is the fact that Eskom is cursed with what is called the full cost recovery model. Although Eskom is called a public utility, it runs like a private corporation, and it's expected to be profitable, and it's expected through the sale of electricity to use revenue to maintain itself, build new power stations, etc., even though most South Africans are unemployed and poor and cannot afford the electricity that Eskom sells. So again, how can you craft the policies around a state-owned utility and not consider the realities and the needs of most South Africans? Again, it's an instance to me of something deeply undemocratic. A very good example of how undemocratic our economy is the policy framework of the government when it comes to the economy, its expenditure, monetary policies, etc. So for the past few years, again, as I've mentioned, we've been witnessing budget cuts. On top of this, people have also been experiencing interest rate hikes. And those very much serve to, embolden creditors, because creditors are the only people who benefit when you consistently rise interest rate hikes, while the rest of South Africans continue falling into debt. At the same time, while their wages are stagnating, and as there is a cost of living crisis as well, and the people who benefit from this are employers and creditors. Another instance of, undemocratic policymaking is the government's attempt to enforce labor market flexibility. So the government has for years said that, look, a huge obstacle to investment is labor. Labor is too loud. Labor is too rigid. Labor is unwilling to negotiate. And they've really inflated, I think, the amount of power unions have in this country as a justification to try and make labor cheaper, more accessible, easier to fire and hire, and easier to be exploitable. And just the final instance of, how deeply undemocratic our economic outlook is, at least the government's economic outlook, is the Just Energy Transition Partnership and the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. And I want to be clear, we need to move on to renewable energy. We need to decarbonize our economy. But the way that the government is pursuing it right now should make us all very concerned in terms of workers and their democratic rights. I mean, there was no democratic consultation or deliberation. Cyril flew off, he came back, we had taken out loans all of a sudden. Number two, there's real concerns from unions and civil society about the policy conditionalities of these loans, about are we witnessing green structural adjustment, the enforcement of neoliberal policies by the IMF, the World Bank, and the international partners group, who are trying to reform and restructure our economy so that when we do get renewables, it's on a for-profit basis. So many of the suggestions made by the World Bank, and I mean, these documents are freely available to read. What do they want? They want more fiscal consolidation. They want more labor market flexibility. They want more budget cuts. They want more privatization. They want to create this energy market that's competitive, and it's going to require the rights of workers being pushed back. It's going to require the rights of communities being pushed back. It's going to require the removal of certain environmental regulations as well. Why were South Africans not thoroughly consulted and brought into the discussion when these partnerships were being made and being agreed upon? And I mean, look, the real concern as well is the loss of South Africa's energy sovereignty. If we unbundle Eskom and pursue this competitive energy market, it means that something as critical as energy is going to be in the hands of multinational and transnational corporations. And it's going to be on a for-profit basis and not on the basis of what is good for most working class, poor, and unemployed South Africans. So I think this is the context in which unions find themselves in. Unions find themselves in a context where they are facing the power of economic elites and political elites who are often willing to cooperate with them and do their bidding. And what neoliberalism does, it makes everything a profit-pursuing scheme. So the power of economic elites it's nothing like it's ever been in history before. Just when you look at the scale of inequality, for example, I mean, 3 people in South Africa have as much wealth as the bottom half of the population. That is a political obstacle to really changing the country. But in terms of the role of unions, I think going forward, and unions like, federations like SAFTU, AMCU, GIWUSA, they've begun slowly to take on these struggles. I think one of the things that unions first need to realize is that they have to put pressure on the government to change its macroeconomic framework. There has to be pressure on the government to realize that interest rates are going to plummet the economy into recession, that austerity is making the lives of working people much more difficult, and that it's also making the lives of the unemployed quite difficult as well. So I think there has to be a push from unions to say that we can't pursue these unsustainable policies. They don't benefit most people. I also think there has to be a push from unions to, bring back the call for a tax on the rich. South Africa cannot be the most unequal country in the world, and yet we never tap into the resources generated by multinational corporations, by the big businesses that are active here. We never tap into those resources and redirect them towards socio-economic development. There needs to be a call to change our tax framework. And of course, as well, there needs to be a call to resist the unbundling of Eskom and the marketization of the energy sector. Because around the world, what's beginning to happen in Europe, in South America, in some parts of Southeast Asia, people are renationalizing. They are realizing that having an energy sector run on a for-profit basis is unsustainable, and it's going to likely deepen energy poverty. And I think as well, unions have begun the call to resist the just energy transition. I think unions have to say, look, we must transition to renewables, but it cannot be at the cost of workers' jobs, at the cost of the environment, at the cost of communities, and at the cost of our energy and policy sovereignty. If we are going to pursue renewable energy, it must be publicly owned and it must be democratically governed. And unions have begun in the past few months, especially, to take on these calls. And I think we're going to be doing more work in the future with civil society organizations, organizations in rural areas, alongside students, young people, to try and build a coalition to have, as we call it, a just transition from below, which is going to require changing our macroeconomic framework. It's going to require changing our governance culture in terms of making it democratic. And it's going to require us to confront the power of economic elites to say, look, if you want to do business in this country, you have to give back. You have to be willing to give some of that surplus towards South Africa's development. But yeah, from my side, I think that's where I see the future of labor unions, is on the energy issue, particularly.
Cool. Thank you very much, Andile. Before, whilst it's still fresh, perhaps maybe let me ask a follow-up around Eskom. Given that we've, even in public discourse around this issue of energy, directly to you, Andile, people seem to have acceded quite easily. And of course, it was in the midst of Ramaphosa in 2019. People seem to have been celebrating somewhat the conversation around unbundling at one of the first State of the Nation addresses that Ramaphosa gave. And of course, given where we are in so far as the ways in which Ramaphosa seems to have configured his own executive, some are calling it a super presidency, and to the extent that he's emboldened his power in this discussion around where our energy sort of transition ought to go. And as you mentioned, some of the sort of things that he's doing of his own accord without any real democratic consensus. Do we think there's still an opportunity for a real intervention, turning things around, readjusting that discussion, especially around ESCOM? Are we not too late? And of course, I say this in the midst of like a lot of discussion more broadly, social media, online, insofar as to what extent things have gone wrong or people have missed a boat insofar as creating the right opportunities for advocacy and lobbying, so that we don't sort of and I say this specifically around things like people saying, for instance, that to some extent the mismanagement of ESCOM or the apparent mismanagement of ESCOM is not a mistake. It's intentional, and to the extent that it emboldens the conversation around the private lobby, the economic and capital lobby having such a significant hand in the way in which government prioritizes its work and its citizens, as it were. What are your thoughts? Are we not too far off the mark? Could we still bring it back?
I think it's that, to me, is one of the most urgent questions in the country right now, because if you observe, if you track the activity of the Presidential Climate Committee, because what's key to remember is that the Just Transition Investment Plan, a key feature of it, a demand from those who are financing this, is the unbundling of ESCOM and the creation of a competitive energy market. So the two things come one in one. So there are big players who are really invested in unbundling continuing as it is. And I don't think we are too far, because what's quite important to remember about public utilities is that they're public utilities. And so fundamentally, they are first and foremost accountable to the people that they're meant to serve. Now, in reality, ESCOM runs like a corporation from the top down. It's very much been fashioned to serve the interests of private players, but we must understand that ESCOM is a utility that belongs to the South African people. And so we need to start behaving like that as well. In order for us to stop this progress, this track of unbundling, firstly, it means that workers in the power sector have to mobilize and organize and educate each other quickly. Because if that's the critical thing about workers in this kind of economy, is that when they're able to be focused, organized, and disciplined and have proposals and programs, and when they're able to build a lot of leverage, they can put pressure on the state and private actors through their suspension of labor to get certain demands and bring them to the negotiation table. So the kind of thing that you need to stop unbundling is really a mass movement. You need a mass movement, a broad coalition of South Africans who have clear demands and clear reasons and objections, and that they can consistently put pressure on government to say, this is an unpopular policy, and if you continue implementing it, it's going to cause XYZ problems. So I think there is time, but the question is, do we have the capacity? Do we have the focus? Do we have the networks and the coalitions to be able to bring about a mass movement for a green new ESCOM or a transformed ESCOM that is truly democratic and publicly owned? That's the issue. I think it's like, are we organized enough and disciplined enough to be able to do that? And I'm not in a position to answer that question, but I think that's the key thing. And then there's another thing that's quite important is, ESCOM's failure. And you're correct in saying that ESCOM's failure feeds into the call for unbundling and privatization in this new energy markets. And look, I meet South Africans all the time who are sick of ESCOM because it makes their lives unbearable in so many ways. It's quite a difficult sell to say that we must transform ESCOM and turn it into a truly, publicly owned and democratic utility. But I think it's important in our advocacy to make it very clear to people that it is policy choices. It was neoliberal policy choices that led ESCOM to where it is now. I am of the opinion that if you were to purge all of the corruption from ESCOM, it would function a lot better. It would have more resources. However, it has fundamental issues which are going to make it unsustainable in the long term. So if ESCOM must make a profit and use revenue to service its fleets, do maintenance, and build new power stations, how can it do that in a context where most people earn like $1.90 US a day? Things like 30-something Rand a day. It's not going to happen. So you need to end those kinds of things if you want a fully functioning ESCOM. I mean, look at ESCOM's outsourcing. Outsourcing has been critical to inviting criminal entities into the utility, and also, sabotaging, or making its maintenance dysfunctional, because outsourcing acts as a way for private actors and actors within the state to collude and reap profits that they shouldn't be profit getting, and redirect those profits towards themselves instead of the people. So you need to change your funding source of ESCOM. You need to say, what pools of money are there available for us that we can access strategically to give ESCOM funding and not get middlemen in the way, which just end up sabotaging or diluting the process. So I think ESCOM's failure, it's policy choices that led to it fundamentally, and we need to remind people of those policy choices.
Thank you very much, Andile. Before we go back to Nondembego, Rice just wants to come in quickly. What are your thoughts on this, Rice?
Thanks. So I just wanted to speak about quickly to, firstly, ESCOM. The Green New ESCOM campaign was launched by the Climate Justice Coalition. It's worth looking up. There's thought that's gone into it. I mean, ESCOM is a strategic national asset, also has a tremendous number of employees who would be reskilled, who can't be left out in the cold as part of the transition and so on. I mean, the other thing is the renewable energy at scale will require the creation of many, many, many jobs. And that's something we very badly need. But in terms of, we can build the movement, we can have the policies, we can bend the ear of the government. So I worked with Amnesty International for about 3 years. I can't remember the number of memoranda I've handed over that just got ignored, or they didn't read, or how many more years must the ANC continue with these policies all the way back to gear for us to go, this is not our government. It's not that the policy decisions, Andile spoke about it at the beginning, the policy decisions are made purposefully because they're serving a certain agenda. And so those people who are serving a certain agenda will continue to serve the agenda. Maybe they'll have the meeting with you. Maybe they'll, put out a press statement, make an empty commitment. But ultimately, they lobbying them is not going to work, and it's not something we have time for when you look at the climate science. And so just to finish with, Asada Shakur said that nobody in history has ever won their freedom by pleading to the conscience or the morality of those who are oppressing them. You have to force them. And I think this is part of the power of the strike tactic. And I think this is, again, underscoring the necessity of not just having a movement, but a party to formalize all of these policies into a minimum program, a minimum socialist program to go into the next election with. Because if we do not do so, we are going to just have meeting after meeting after meeting with Ramaphosa administration, and we will be ignored, and the foreign direct investors will be listened to. And we know that this is the state of affairs. And so there is no reformist alternative with the ANC. We need a mass movement under a socialist program towards the polls to oust them.
Cool. Thank you very much, Rais. Mrs. Nondembego, then if as someone who's not inside the organizing of labor, for instance, as someone who's involved largely in the civil society, NGO spaces, perhaps if I may ask, am I missing something insofar as the ways in which labor has been able to organize over at least the past decade, the past 10 years? To a large extent, there's a sense that labor movements are absent from some of the more key discussions, at least in so far as their ability to mobilize en masse. Their ability to create the sort of friction with the government of the day that we used to see back pre-1994, but also in the early sort of mid-2000s. I remember when I was still in school, SATU used to be able to shut down schools in a very significant way. There were actual shutdowns that were happening, not necessarily spurred on by political parties, as we saw with the recent one in this country, where even with the shutdown, the idea of a stay away, we saw numbers on the streets. Is fragmentation to blame? Is sort of labor not necessarily being visible to blame? or are citizens who are not necessarily involved in the organizing of labor not aware enough about the work that labor is doing? Where would you sort of pinpoint the issue?
Thank you, Spa. One should not, I think we should not be defensive in admitting that the unity of labor movement is very much sacrosanct in saving the situation that the workers and the country is under. Maybe one, if I can just go back a bit to the issue of ESCOM, I will fully agree that with Andile to say that it should also start with the employees that are within ESCOM to assist us to save ESCOM, meaning that you will know that ESCOM is being organized by quite a number of unions. If those unions, they can just consolidate each other, coming with one voice just for the interest of saving ESCOM, because they are the ones who've got more information at hand. If you remember, even the previous CEO, Andre de Ruyter, did indicate, though one will say that it's just a question for another day to say that, did he indicate willingly to say that there is a corruption and there are people that are key role players in making sure that they continue with their own agenda? As to when did he report it, it's a question for another day. But the reality, we've got the information from the former CEO. And what did we do about that information? I think it's only SAFTU that lodged opened a case at the police station. Hence, I'm saying that we cannot dismiss the fact that we do need to be united in this. COSATU was not where to be found, and I know that they do have a union under the NUM that is organizing there. What is their view? What is their position on what the Ruyter has said? So if we're not going to be united to save the country on what we are seeing, it's quite problematic. But we can see that also the government, I fully agree with Andile, that the government does not have an interest. Their policies, they are far, far, far away to save the workers on this situation. You look at the joke that just happened, and it was all over Facebook, and one sits and say, but honestly, it might sound as a joke, but honestly, it is true. The employment of the Minister of Electricity without powers, it was just something else in our country. For the whole president to go there, announce we're going to have a Minister of Electricity, it took 2 months for the minister. He was earning salary, because the understanding is that in terms of labor, you first render services in order for you to be paid. But then he was already rendering service to who we don't know, because there was no power, there was no accountability, and we were all silent. And we know that. Hence, I'm saying that if we don't unite, it's true that we have to also accept that we are also playing a very significant role. In fact, we are dancing also in the policies that are being thrown to us. We are part of that. But also, I'll also want to agree that we really do need to pressurize the government to pursue policies that will be in favor of the workers and the working class, other than these things that are squeezing the workers. I agree we need to change the tax framework, but when we are talking about the voice of workers, we also need to agree that we should know that this should start from at a lower level. It does not just get there. I fully agree with Rais when he says that the country does need an alternative. Currently, there is no alternative. That's why people, they just mushroom at any time, because they believe that they can be an alternative. But the how part of how do we build this alternative, it should also be taken into consideration. We must make sure that we are deeply involved in our communities. That is why SAFTU believes that before you become a worker, you are a community individual or person. You belong to a certain community. So your struggle should not be a struggle that belongs to locals. When we say it belongs to locals, you understand that in terms of labor, when they knock in, obviously there will be locals where you put your lunchbox and everything, you lock it, you go, you work After that, you lock, you leave everything in the company premises. SAFTU does not believe in that. SAFTU believes on activism. That is why even our May Day, our approach, if one can say that, what is this, maybe the solution to this crisis? The approach of SAFTU is saying, let us go back to our roots as trade unions. That's why we're saying history is telling us that this year, 2023, we're celebrating the 1973 of the Durban strikes, where trade unionism was not fashionable, in the sense that you will have to sacrifice your time, in the sense that you will have to be selflessly giving to the members. Serving should not be, maybe we also need to agree that the benefits that we have given to us, that is given to us as leaders, is also compromising our voices to voice out many things that are happening, because we want to protect all these benefits that are given to the leadership of trade unions, because there are benefits in trade unions, but I doubt that there are benefits that should serve as a stock suite where we should be silent on things that we should be vocal about. But I also want to agree also with Rais when he says that there is also a regress in labor movement. That's why I'm saying I don't want to say maybe it's the benefits, but there is a regress. One would have expect that we are far in our democracy, because when you sit, you count. We've got a president who's a former trade unionist, not just a former trade unionist. I'm not talking about a member. I'm talking about people who have occupied senior position of being national office bearers, their president, your general secretaries of trade unions, because our president is coming from the National Union of Mine Workers. You've got the Minister of Employment and Labor, who is a former trade unionist, of which to you it's supposed to say that our conditions, they're supposed to be much more better. You've got the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy. You've got a Minister of Finance. You've got a Minister of Trade and Industry. You can count many, but you ask yourself, but why everything? What else do we want? Because when you check all these positions that I'm counting, president, finance, trade and mineral resources, they are key. They are very much key. What else do we want as workers? Hence, I'm saying that one will not dismiss, or one will not shy away, that the more we are fragmented, the more we don't put pressure, the more we think that, because I will agree that in terms of the constitution, members, they've got a right to belong to their union of their choice, as well as their federation of their choice. But there should be something that is going to unite the labor, which we should also stand up. We have been having many campaigns, and we have been doing these campaigns alone. The last time, which was very progressive, we had a campaign, was on the 24th of August, where COSATU also joined us, when we were addressing quite a number of things that are affecting the workers. But we've just joined the EFF when they were having their shutdown on the 20th of March, and of which, despite the fact that the EFF is the EFF, but I think the call that was made by the EFF was a call that was affecting each and every worker. It was a call that was affecting each and every individual of the country. We should not be sectarian. The minute we are sectarian, I think we must accept that the neoliberal policies have already defeated us. Because the capitalists, they unite, whether they are saying different things in their corners, but they are good in uniting themselves. But the working class, we are very, very, very sectarian, and it's difficult for us to challenge those things. Last week, on the 25th, SAFTU we had a picketing, quite a very small number of people. We picketed at the Reserve Bank in Pretoria. There were very few people that have joined to say that so when there's a smaller voice, we have to agree, because it looked like not everyone will be affected by the repo rate. it's the few individuals. So that's why they keep on hammering, because our unity, I fully agree, it is sacrosanct, and our unity is the one that will change many policies that are being imposed to us, and our unity will be the one that will serve as a threat. But as long as we are still operating in our small corners, and as long as we are still operating in different spaces where we are, it is still going to be a challenge. When I normally put it, I normally say the disadvantage of us being fragmented, or the more we are not united, the more or the fatter the table of the capitalist becomes, to a point that they just mess everywhere. They can't know. That is why now we find ourselves in a situation where people will employ ministers without giving them powers, but they still have salaries and the contracts have already been signed. You ask yourself, you wonder what was signed when there are no powers given. Because the table is fat of the capitalists, they can do anything as they wish with us because we are not united. So our unity, I think, it will make a difference in saving the situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, thank you very much. Before you go, Ms. Nontembeko, again, I think you've responded briefly to the question asked by Nkateko Mabasa here in our comment section. He says, why do union leaders often work against the interests of workers they are supposed to represent? And I think you spoke briefly about that there's a potential insofar as the benefits, for instance, that might be attained once certain people get to certain positions, that they might feel conflicted in some of those instances. He then expands his questions to say, are workers not better represented by NGOs and political parties instead of labor unions? If you could engage that one. And then the second one that I'd ask you to please engage from Hansa Naika in our comment section as well is, why were unions, for instance, silenced during COVID-19, when workers suffered the most from UIF monies being stolen and not getting paid? But also we're in a space now where people still seem to be working short time 3 years down the line since the advent of COVID. So the first one is, are workers not better represented by NGOs and political parties, which is the one that was extrapolated from the way in which union workers seem to not work in the interests of workers that they're supposed to be representing. And then the second one is around COVID-19. There's a sense that unions were silent in that discourse. Do you have any comment on those?
Yes, I should start on the representation of workers by the NGOs. Remember, our country is a country that is governed by law, as I have already indicated that a good example, one, we can remember that the economic freedom fighters, they have always been having a sort of a labor desk, which I think they are starting to register, because to represent a worker, you need to follow the law. The LRA is clear. You need to be a registered trade union, because representation of workers, it will mean that those workers, they need to pay subscriptions. So the payment of subscriptions should be going to a legal entity, meaning that you should undergo the process of the Department of Labor, where you need to be registered in order for you to be in possession of the stop orders in the form of the subscriptions from the members. So it can't be then that any person can just go and represent. It is by law that a registered trade union, it needs to represent workers. It can't be an NGO, it can't be anything about that. The LRA is clear as to who can represent the workers. And then on the, maybe I can say that on the frustration of lack of representation, because we also need to acknowledge that we do have challenges in terms of servicing those members that have decided to join the union. Hence, I'm saying that I'm not sure whether it is a system, because I know capitalism is very strong. It is a system that even if I acquire this position, I think that when I say something, I should not have said it, because I might lose the position. And I'm saying that the position we acquired and the benefits that are there, they should not be served as a stock suit to keep us quiet so that we cannot say things that we support. In fact, the election of any office bearer and the employment of any union organizer is to make sure that you voice out anything that is a frustration to workers. There should not be anything that should silence you. You should voice it without any fear or any favor or any contradictions when you do that. Then the second question is the silence of the unions when it comes to during the COVID-19. I doubt that the unions were quiet, especially if members they have been reporting to their unions, because remember there was a limitation in terms of movement, meaning that the unions also they were having challenges. I remember at some point I was listening to SAFM where they were arguing that of which I on that one I also accept that were people who are very slow to move to with the 4IR. We're very slow to move with the fourth IR. That is why I'm saying that one could have said during the COVID, there was no movement of general meetings where the union officials are able to collect mandate and also they are able to get the grievances on the ground floor because there were limitations. Even if that's so, remember, even if you want to move with the fourth IR, that's why I'm saying I admit, and at the same time I can justify that. Remember, we're dealing with the workers who, in order for you to convene a meeting, it only can be convened through a webinar and it needs a data. And at some time there is no data for workers to convene that. So I might say there might have been those challenges on the basis of collecting such information because the movement was limited. Those who have got email, maybe they could have sent it, but also the email, it needs a data. So there might be challenges that were of that nature to address that. But on the issue of short time, we must also agree that it's not only during the COVID. Even now, we're still experiencing the short time. Workers are still asked to work short time on the basis of the load shedding. That's the other serious impact that the load shedding does have on the workers, because on the manufacturing, on the production side, once the company is load shedded, obviously it tells you that there is no load shed. I mean, there is no production in the workplace, and therefore the employers, they need to ask workers to work short time because it will, to them, it will be a wasteful expenditure to keep people that will not be that will be just marking the register, but there is no production in place. So on that one, the short time is still a crisis or a challenge that we are faced with currently and seriously when it comes to load shedding. And the retrenchments, those are the other challenges that we are faced with when it comes to load shedding, because if they have to minus the hours due to load shedding, obviously it means that there should be lesser staff or there should be lesser employees in the workplace. So that's the other challenge that we are faced with.
Thank you very much, Ms. Luzipo, for your feedback. This is the Deputy General Secretary as the South African Federation of Trade Unions, speaking to us just on some key issues that are confronted by the labor movements in our country. And of course, we have two other speakers, Andile Zulu from AIDC, as well as Rais Nurbai from Socialist Youth Movement. And I'll ask Rais to come in here. And he wanted to come in specifically around the question of, are workers not better represented by NGOs and political parties instead of labor movements, as one of the questions that I'd like to engage with. And of course, in your address, you were speaking about sort of dismantling the capitalist state and transitioning towards a more socialist one. And for people who haven't read Marx and other authors in this area, what does that actually look like in practical terms? What are the main manifestations of a state that is socialist in your view? And you spoke a bit earlier and about the mushrooming of political parties ahead of 2024, and speaking about rise to some extent. What should be the work of new political entrants into the game? If for instance, the idea of a mass workers' party doesn't manifest, or doesn't come up next year, or whatever the situation might be, if a new political entrant wants to make do right by workers, do right by labor, what are the sort of channels that you feel should be engaged in order to be adequately representative, adequately engaged, and adequately sort of activists in that space to qualify for sort of some level of support from the labor side, right? I know that's quite a mouthful, but I trust you're very capable.
So just go through them one by one. First, I did speak to the matter of the party quite extensively. I do want to speak to NGOs. So NGOs, even though, I mean, they're nonprofits and so on, they operate with a corporatized structure. They are not internally democratic. And in fact, I mean, in as much as the workers of NGOs are identified as by their labor, they have good incentive in many cases to unionize against the employer, but that is the NGO. I mean, we even have NGOs that claim to stand for human rights and social justice who are casualizing labor, who are exploiting interns and new entrants into the workplace and so on. And so NGOs shouldn't get a pass in terms of, we shouldn't be viewing NGOs as an alternative to unions, but NGOs as a space of employment where unions can play a role in ensuring that those workers see justice, those workers have a livable wage and just working conditions and so on. So that's one. Two, what does socialism look like? I think it's fitting to start with the policy that for socialist policy we've been saying again and again since 2015 is free quality decolonized education for all is one pillar. Free quality healthcare for all. I mean, Chris Hani made the point, I don't know the exact wording, but in many ways socialism isn't about heavy theory and so on. It's so that none of our people are homeless or hungry or without healthcare or without education. Nobody is condemned to desolate material conditions on account of an accident of birth. And that's the idea is in obviously worker control of the means of production, right? So just to get to the way in which the macroeconomy would be structured. And so, yes, we do stand for the nationalization of the commanding heights of the economy under democratic worker control and with the consent and involvement of communities, particularly with respect to mines when it comes to communities and so on. And so that's one policy, but also a planned economy. The idea that it's scary to plan an economy as opposed to leaving it to the market and seeing who comes out alive. Apparently that's the less scary part, and there's a lot of fear mongering around the people who in many ways manufacture the economy as it is. And so planning a socialist economy would also mean training people for the next generation of renewable energy jobs. I mean, that is a massive push that we need to make now. I mean, we can speak about other tenets of the fourth industrial revolution afterwards, but we need a massive industrial scale rollout of renewable energy, and that's a big one. And so I'm paraphrasing a friend of mine, William Shoki, I don't know if you know him, who said something to the effect of, capitalism prevents the self-actualization of human beings, that we can't become fully ourselves under a capitalist society. And socialism affords us the oxygen to breathe. And there is a socialism to build, most certainly. It's not just about tearing down capitalism. There's two sides to that task. And so, yeah, it's when it comes to, the socialist society, in many ways, we agree with the anarchists in some regards. Engels said that eventually the state will wither from the governance of people to the administration of things. Those debates can be had, but ultimately the fundamental tenets of socialism just flow from a perspective of nobody should starve because they were born into the wrong class background. Just on your last question, which was on another party coming in, even the EFF for argument's sake. If the Mass Workers' Party doesn't come out, I mean, I can't speak on behalf of the Socialist Youth Movement now or the Workers' and Socialist Party, but in situations like that, you do consider a conditional strategic vote, because boycotting the ballot box is also something that could be very destructive. So it is making those decisions, but of course, I mean, the distinction that you made about the character of this party as a socialist party that is, standing for workers, that would get almost certainly get support. But I think that what's crucial is that this process is led by SAFTU. I think SAFTU is the body that has the power to do so, to convene the Working Class Summit, and to make sure that this makes the impact it needs to make. Taking hundreds of thousands of workers who pay dues to the unions and turning them into hundreds of thousands of voters for the Mass Workers' Party. It's an election strategy that is worth trying at the very least. But I mean, we've had cases where union leadership has run for public office, and in some ways there was a vote of no confidence from their own members in how bad the election turnout was. And so, just to return to the point, if the Mass Workers' Party does require as a prerequisite the unity of the labor movement, if we start fracturing from the outset, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. And so, yeah, I think that is all three questions that I was asked. But just to talk to socialism and utopianism, just to finish, in that, we as Marxists, it's funny, people assume that we are utopian, and Marx pointedly critiques the utopians. But there's this quote from an activist, and I can never recall their name, but I am again paraphrasing, but utopia lies on the horizon, and every step we take towards it, it takes one step away from us. The point, though, is to keep moving. And I think that's the spirit we need to take in, and especially in a mass way with rolling mass action.
Thank you very much, Rais. I am very appreciative of you having taken the time to elaborate on some of those issues. I think it's important then, Andile, perhaps then, do you think, like, for instance, the conversation around the electoral amendment bill, not necessarily that, but also just electoral reform in general, is a space for some of these ideas to be contested around what worker representation looks like in the broader sort of political sphere, especially because one of the things that we were challenged by earlier as we were speaking is the tripartite alliance and sort of proximity that Labour ended up in cahoots with the government of the day in some respects, and to the economic sort of situation of the day. Does sort of power corrupt? Absolutely, as the saying says. So to the extent that once you get into the spaces of power, what's the likelihood of forgetting what the mandate was? But also, when we talk about the electoral reform conversation, I think Rice caught a bit of that at the end around the ability to say a vote of no confidence from a constituency basis, not necessarily from once you're in the National Assembly. How do we bring you back home when you're no longer serving the needs of the people, as it were?
I think, yeah, the conversation about electoral politics and alternatives, it's difficult because I think on the one hand, many of the parties as they stand right now, and I think this is why people struggle to find an alternative, many of the parties that they stand right now actually have a lot of policy consensus. Like the difference between the ANC and the DA, for example, in terms of macroeconomic policy is not really significant. And that the same applies to the IFP and towards COPE and GOOD. Many parties generally have the perspective that, look, you need to keep this neoliberal economy down. And where they generally disagree is the extent to which the state intervenes and the kinds of support that it provides, etc. So I think that, number one, just makes politics uncompelling for people because it all very much looks the same. And then on the other hand, there's also a question of how effective electoral politics can be when there's such an asymmetry of power between the state and the private sector. So I don't think we're in a situation, for example, where the private sector dictates policy, but they have the leverage because of their control of the economy, both domestically and abroad, and they're able to signal their preferences towards government. So the question is, if you're able to obtain electoral power, if you're able to obtain power in the legislature as well, how do you resist that leverage? How do you have real sovereignty in terms of policy and independence from the private sector as well? But I do always think that the push to get electoral power is a great way to build campaigns. It's a great way to do public advocacy and to do public policy work as well. There have been discussions in some sectors of civil society and unions about like challenging the government's austerity measures through a court case. And whether that can be won or not is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that you build a lot of awareness, you build a lot of momentum around resisting those measures. So I think the electoral space is for Labour is an interesting place to be. I do think there's a need for a workers' party. But again, that's, I was watching a documentary a few weeks ago about the German Revolution back in the early 1920s. And when you look at, that precedes, the world is very different back then. The conditions are different. But when you look at the levels of organization, the levels of discipline, how widespread it was, how long it lasted, and how threatened the private sector felt and the monarchy, you realize that we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do because the unfortunate thing is that, the neoliberalism of the government, what it does, that it degrades people's quality of life. Many people are just too tired, exhausted, trying to survive to be involved in politics in the first place or even have a care about it. So that's one thing. I think that's why, to me, the policy question is very important. The pursuit of different policies isn't an end in of itself, but it's to give people breathing room. People need to be able to breathe in the first instance before they pursue more militant and radical politics. If everyone is stuck in a struggle for survival, they're not going to want to do like 6-month strikes and stayaways because it's like, well, what else am I going to rely on then? If you don't have a BIG, if you don't have thorough social welfare. And of course, once you get those things, if you are able to get them, the difficult question then becomes, how do you push for more things afterwards as well? So if we were to get a basic income grant, if we were to get a tax on the 1% richest of the population, how do you ensure that people don't give up then and continue to push on forward? And yeah, look, I think there has to be that building of that workers' party. But it's difficult because, again, there are many sectors of the economy that haven't been unionized. People within retail, people within many of the services industry, people within the gig economy as well. Like, it's a tough question that, comrades like Nontembeko have to face. How do you unionize people in Uber where they don't know where their boss is located? There aren't any offices in most of the 9 provinces. How do you organize this growing regime of precarious labor that's like dislocated from a physical place, that has no representation in terms of like a formal employee, has no human resources department? So capitalism is changing. It's changing quite drastically. And many workers are no longer united increasingly in factories and mines. So our strategies for organizing labor, capacitating organized labor, have to adapt to that environment as well. I think my departing thing is that, look, there's a lot of work to do in the electoral space. And it has to be done quickly because there's the climate crisis. There's a crisis that could happen after 2024. We don't know what kind of conservative and like deeply conservative and reactionary coalitions could come after that. And I think the biggest struggle to me in terms of labor, just the final thing that I'll say, is not necessarily the private sector at first, but what it is the class of kleptocrats that have been created from this crusade of corruption in the past like 10 to 15 years. You have people within many state-owned utilities, within the bureaucracy, within many arms of government, and in the private sector who have made corruption their means of survival. It's an economy within itself. And those actors are also very violent and they're very resourced. And when you challenge their power, they're not unwilling to use violence. So Before, like, if you're going to build a campaign, for example, to reclaim ESCOM as a public utility, those are the actors who are going to be your first form of opposition. And you really need to be prepared for that. And you need to be able to build the mass leverage to be able to resist that. I think in the next 10 years, that's going to be the real issue, is this class of kleptocrats. Before you deal with the IMF and Lonmin and, I mean, Anglo Gold and whatnot, it's going to be this class of kleptocrats there. And they're also in the electoral space as well. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of electoral politics for working people.
Cool. Thank you very much, Andile. I'm going to ask everyone to say 2 or 3 minutes in closing as we round up this discussion. Thank you to everyone who's been able to join us so far. And any further questions, engagement, we look forward to seeing both on this stream on YouTube, but also on our various social media handles that we'll be sharing. Andile, let me start with you, and then we'll go to Rais, and then we'll end off with Nontembeko insofar as the closing remarks. And perhaps, since you've mentioned quite a lot of the stuff that I'm sure you wanted to end off with, maybe as someone who's working as an ally in the space of labor, for instance, with the AIDC, a lot of the work is around allyship and working with labor to get them to a point where you feel that there's a critical mass to some extent. Help us define the work of NGOs in the short to medium term, at least towards getting us to the point where we are adequately able to mobilize various groups of society towards this goal of reconfiguring government and the state in a way that is meaningful for labor, meaningful for all citizens, as Rais categorized it earlier as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's something that, you know, NGOs, as more NGOs need to really figure out what their relationship is with organized labor. And I think what it is, it's recognizing that the job of trade unions who are, you know, sincerely committed to their politics and really in the trenches in terms of fighting for workers, it's a very difficult job to do, especially under these adverse conditions that we've all been, you know, talking about for the past, you know, hour or so. So it's about what resources do you have, what capacities and skills do you have, and how can you build a cooperative relationship to provide those capacities and skills towards trade unions. So for example, you know, trade unions have to do a lot of research in terms of commenting, responding, educating people on policy. So again, how can NGOs bolster their research work in cooperation with trade unions to do that? You know, if trade unions are dealing with a new issue that is just sort of like I mean, the just transition, the just energy transition partnership is something that has kind of taken all of us by surprise. So the question then is for us as civil society and NGOs, what can we unveil about this thing? And how can we provide research and disseminate knowledge that is useful for workers, for organized trade unions as well? You know, trade unions have to do a lot of popular education work. So as NGOs, how can we provide resources there in terms of videos, in terms of film, in terms of, you know, giving them actual spaces and facilities to do their popular education work as well? It also means, like, you know, taking your job seriously in terms of being where workers are with trade unions. If there is some form of popular education work that is happening in, you know, wherever it needs to happen, it means making yourself available and, you know, getting to know that community, getting to know people within the union as well. And for me, it's just, it's, you know, using our capacities to help unions capacitate themselves. Because again, the work that they do is broad, it's difficult under adverse conditions. There are a lot of funding issues as well. And so it's like, how can we cooperate? And I think cooperate is quite important. It's not about leading, it's about cooperating with trade unions, because again, they have a democratic base. They have a popular legitimacy through which they're able to function. So, and I think that's the thing with NGOs as well. I think it's about, you know, taking your principles seriously in cooperation with trade unions. So for me, and for AIDC specifically, our thing has always been research, disseminating knowledge, doing popular education work, and helping grassroots movements, activists, and trade unions build counterpower against political elites and against economic elites who don't have the best interests of South Africans involved. And I think one of the things that we need to do in the next few months as well as NGOs is intervene in public debates where we see trade unions taking a stance against austerity, against unbundling, against the Just Energy Transition Partnership, speaking up about climate change, intervening in public spaces to take back the debate from corporate-sponsored media, because that's the problem that's happening right now. A lot of corporate-sponsored media is dominating the debate around these issues, and I think there's ways for NGOs and trade unions to collaborate to push back against that as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Andile. Thank you very much for your insight and for your commitment to being a part of the conversation. Rais, what are your parting thoughts rather, and what is the call that you'd like to make to South Africans alike, but primarily in the labor space?
So I do think I've spoken at length to the Mass Workers Party, and I'll repeat it, that we need a party, not just repeating it for the purposes of the people listening, but also for our comrades on the panel, and that this is something we do need to move on. We need to move on it quickly. I do agree. There is a lot of work ahead. It can be overwhelming to think about it, but this is our task. And I just want to speak to, the issue of organizing labor in microcosm and the fight for free education. For a long time, teaching assistants, so tutors and demonstrators, the postgraduate students that help every university function, not help, they're the backbone of the academic program. They are, so I'm a tutor as well. So like we're routinely exploited. I mean, we're paid 4 times a year and they paid us 1 month late. And there's been the sort of, everybody's been in silos, so people haven't been comparing their rates, realizing that people in the same faculty aren't being paid the same. And so it's a whole mess of issues that's going on that's now driving us as the Socialist Youth Movement to start unionizing those student workers. But just to look at that on 2 fronts. One is, yes, this is a sector of precariously employed, exploited workers that needs representation for the purposes of their own material needs and for the purposes of justice for themselves, 1. But 2, fees must fall since 2015. We went to the union buildings. 2016, fees must fall became an occupation, a war, a curfew, so many different things. In 2016, we saw the full brunt of the state's police brutality. In 2021, when we protested against the financial exclusion crisis, we successfully shut down Wits on Monday. On Tuesday, we took to the roads. We met the rubber bullets very, very quickly. And so, and that's been the trend, brutalization. We saw it earlier this year at other institutions where they would, the idea is, exhaust us by ignoring us, brutalize us, militarize the campus, make it an unsafe space for us to organize and cripple us. And it's been working as a counter tactic against the movement for free education. The thing is, if we have the significant number of postgraduate students who are teaching assistants, who are unionized, decide to go on strike, the university stops functioning altogether. You shut down the whole institution without having to block one gate. And so in terms of that, yes, on one hand, it's a power for us to wield in order to ensure that those workers get justice, those student workers. But on the other hand, it's a tactical necessity in the movement for free education. And I think that really just underscores how a united and organized working class, really guided by a socialist program, is genuinely a force to be reckoned with and can change the politics. And I do believe concerning the fight for free education, which obviously we need other sectors of society, we need to reinforce each other's struggles. But this element of bringing in the politics of labor into the fight for free education, into the legacy of fees must fall, is overdue. And when done properly, it will completely change the game concerning our discourses on university shutdowns, our discourses on the urgency with which they meet our demands, because we know what it's like to be ignored again. We know what it's like to lobby and so on. And so, yeah, that's just what I want to understate, is that the power of a united working class, and that goes for everywhere. If in NGOs, in working for large corporations, and working for universities, which we know very frequently function like corporations. And the idea is to organize, unionize, and if need be, strike. And I think that is one of our sharpest tools moving forward, and it's something that we should be very cognizant of in terms of what our arsenal is in both the movement for free education, but also the broader struggle against capitalism, against austerity, against the ANC government, which has set up that macro structure in which this racket has been able to carry on. And that's what I want to end with. Also,
thank you. Thank you very much, Rais. Your insight was quite interesting and engaging. I appreciate the lengths to which you were able to draw a picture for us, at least in terms of what the work looks like from the labor movement side, but also what we ought to do as people who are coming along in the conversation, insofar as the different things and the different policies that we're likely to fight for, and on whose behalf we're doing that for. So I'm going to end with you, Ms. Nondembego Luzipo, Deputy Secretary General of SAFTU. Firstly, thank you very much for joining us and for making time for this discussion. It was important that we have your voice in the space, and we really appreciate. And I echo a lot of the comments. Some of the comments were saying we really need more female leaders like yourself in the space, and we appreciate that workers were able to recognize that in you and put you in a position of power in the union. So what would be your closing comments to the discussion that we've been having today, as we were discussing the role of labor movements in consolidating South Africa's democracy and development? And then, of course, recognizing that it's not just about consolidating, it's about recreating or recrafting for whatever purposes we see fit.
Thank you, Spa, and thanks to the Mail and Guardian as well for recognizing SAFTU. Maybe in closing, one will have to say that we need to appreciate our democracy. Because the good thing about our democracy is that at least it does recognize your Freedom Day. It does recognize your Youth Day. It does recognize the Women's Day. There are quite a number of things that our democracy wants us to recognize. But the bigger question is, as trade union federations and as NGOs, what role are we playing? I think we should begin to unite and in building up, because one thing that SAFT is not apologetical on it is the fact that there is a need for an alternative. But we should also have a question, or we should answer as to how do we build it, because it should not be an alternative that is just, we have it. It needs to have a process of it being conceived up until it has been born. So the process of conceiving, one would say that there should be a unity in the working class movements within our communities. Hence, I'm saying that we need to work closer together using the constitution that we have, that at least recognizes your Youth Day, where we know that at least we are closer to the youth formations that are within our society. We are closer to the women formations that are within our society. We address all the social ills when we have to celebrate that, but without also having gathered together and try and work together so that we can know what we are building. Obviously, we will still be found wanting, and we must accept that we have dismally failed for the future of the country. The other thing is that as long as we still have got, when
I think we may have lost Ms. Luzipo there. Hopefully it's not an issue of ESCOM, but there are other more challenging things. Of course, we've discussed ESCOM at length, and we do appreciate Ms. Luzipo's insight. So on behalf of the Democracy Development Program and our donor partners, as well as our staff here at the DDP, including our Executive Director, Dr. Paul Kariuki, would like to give thanks to the Mail and Guardian team for ensuring that this was adequately advertised and engaging, and we look forward to convening once more later on in the year around the different subject matter. And of course, please feel free to share the link to this on their YouTube page. Continue to comment and engage. I'll make sure that we are able to surface some of the rich discussion that is happening in the comment section. Maybe to name some of the more active participants, like Nkateko Mabasa, Hansan Haika, Boniwe Duster, and then of course a variety of our comrades who were able to join. Thank you very much, Maureen, for your feedback and input into the discussion. So we do appreciate once more Andile, Rais, as well as Nontembego for engaging us in this discussion, and we look forward to engaging with you once more in future. Of course, have a good afternoon and safe journeys to wherever you might be going. Take care to everyone, and look forward to hearing from you at another point. And of course, apologies for the connection issues that we experienced with Sis Nontembego. She will be passing her regards, and thank you very much for having engaged us. Thank you.
Plato said, "Who will guard the guardians? Who are our guardians? Do they care about us? Are they accountable for their actions, or are they above the law? Who elects these guardians? Us? Them? Someone else? And if they guard us, who will guard them? Who will guard the guardians?"